Good.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for some of our colleagues. I'm very happy to be here with you. This second online session is the Nature and Biodiversity Finance Landscape. We are very happy with the Frankfurt School to invite you to this session. I will let Frankfurt School to present it to you. And I just want to remind you that you can still register for the in-person biodiversity IDFC training in September in south of France. If you have any doubt or further question, please just let me know. I would be very happy to respond and to help you to register. Jonas, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Galeen, for the nice introduction words. And hello, welcome back, everyone. A few of you just saw it from the listener list. Have joined already in the first session, which we had a few weeks ago. So very happy to continue this series. Very briefly, only about ourselves before we then start with the discussion. So who we are. So we're very happy to work with the IDFC and the AfD on this training, on capacity building measure series, actually, I have to say, because we're talking about quite a midterm, long-term engagement. Very briefly about ourselves. So yeah, Frankfurt School is a leading business school in Europe. We have the so-called accredited with the so-called Triple Crown accreditation, which is AACSB, AMBA, and EQUIS. And what we are doing actually is like on one hand combining what we have in what were the newest trends in the academic in the scientific field, but then also like what we are doing a lot of project implementation on ground, working directly with clients, with banks, including DFIs in 130 different countries. And in the executive education division, what we are doing is just to combine these two perspectives, the academic perspective as well as the practical implementation perspective, to build and to construct sound educational programs. Sustainable finance and everything related to sustainable finance, might it be climate finance, might it be financing for renewable energy or biodiversity finance. We rely on two different institutes which are hosted at Frankfurt School. One is the Frankfurt School UNEP Collaborating Center for Climate and Sustainable Energy Finance, and the other one is the Future Institute for Sustainable Transformation, really like also developing together with stakeholders sound solutions to overcoming the current challenges. About myself, so my name is Jonas Flair. I'm Director for Green and Sustainable Finance in the Executive and Professional Education Division at Frankfurt School. Here leading different local, national, but also global programs in education. We were also pioneer in online and hybrid teaching. So really long time ago, we started in 2010. So really long time ago. And I personally have a background in natural resource governance and development studies, but also several certifications by Frankfurt School in the field of sustainable and climate and biodiversity finance. And I'm here together with my colleague. Maybe you want also quickly to introduce yourself, Fabian.
Thank you, Jonas. So hi, everyone. Once again, welcome to this session. My name is Fabian Garavito. I'm part of the Frankfurt School UNEP Center. So I focus on the acquisition and development of different projects in different regions on different sustainable finance topics with an emphasis on biodiversity finance projects. So I'm really happy to be here today to discuss the biodiversity finance landscape in detail.
Thank you, Fabian. We have also a third colleague with us today. He will join in a few seconds and present you, I would not say too much, will present you something upcoming, which is my colleague Michael König. But I will give you the word, Michael, as soon as we are there at this stage. Hi, Michael.
Nice to meet you. That works well. Thank you very much, Jonas. Yeah, hello all. Also from my side, Michael König, working at the Frankfurt School UNEP Collaborating Center on Sustainable Finance, and currently I'm in Sevilla at the Finance for Development conference, and here on site the topic of nature and biodiversity aspects gained quite momentum in the SDG nexus at all, and the crucial question about financing sources estimates, flows, and gaps is here quite dominant, and so it's a topic that comes right into place. And I'm happy to also tell you later a bit more. A couple of comments. Oops, sorry, I'm on my mobile, so please excuse also my techniques. In a minute, tell you a bit more on the current ongoing work that we do at the Frankfurt School.
Okay, now I saw you are muted, Michael.
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me.
No,
So yeah, tell you more about the key publications in the space of financing nature-based solutions, financing nature-positive activities. But yeah, when it comes to Jonas, just bring me in the discussion. Over to you, Beck. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael, for your introduction. So to kick us off, let's quickly think about and to recap what we have learned from the, what are your key takeaways from the online session 1, which we had a few weeks ago. I think there was also a recording shared, as well as a few of you I see from the names in the participant list have also joined the first session. So please scan the QR code. You will need this QR code and like this Slido also throughout the session for different activities which you have planned for you. So please, let's have a recap what we discussed. What are your key takeaways from the online session 1, which we had a few weeks ago? Let's give you a bit of time. Just like scan the QR code. You will definitely need it. And then let's quickly collect a few things from key takeaways from the online session 1. It's again like a reminder, it was a scientific basis or science basis for nature, biodiversity. We discussed ecosystems, ecosystem services. We discussed different drivers for biodiversity loss. We discussed impacts, dependencies on companies, as well as financial institutions. We had a look at different also transmission channels, metrics, indicators. Okay, global natures, global goals. Anyone else want to share something that we had? Okay, looks like that also there are quite a lot of new colleagues who are joining this session today. So quickly then to recap, thank you for participating in this one. And then really briefly like to see what we had done so far. So we had the first online session in the beginning of June and was the science of nature and biodiversity. Today we are then talking about the nature biodiversity finance landscape. Then we have another session where we're looking a bit more at strategy, also like the different commitments and international frameworks. And then which is the third session. Just mark it here, the third session, and then we have, as Galen has introduced earlier, looking forward to welcome, hopefully also quite a lot of you for the on-site training in France from 8 to 12 of September. And then we have 2 more online sessions. One is more dedicated to the TNFD application, as well as deep dive into evaluation methodologies for biodiversity investments. Good, then let's kick us off today. As we have just mentioned, it's like the second session, and we are talking about, or really providing like a snapshot of like what is the nature biodiversity finance landscape. Again, I also see it here from the participant list already. Quite a few are quite experienced also in this field. You are also maybe in your institution have a function, a key function, also with regards to biodiversity. So every time you would like to share something, insights from your institution, from your current work in the field of biodiversity, nature-related finance or activities, feel free to jump in, activate your microphone. Let's have this also like a lively discussion, and also share of experience, because I think this will make the session quite interactive. What do we have planned for you? As I've mentioned earlier, we will have at the beginning a quick sneak peek to the State of Nature Finance 2025, where Frankfurt School is involved. Then we are talking about chapter 1 about understanding the biodiversity finance ecosystem. So we have a look at the different of the biodiversity finance landscape and different types of financing mechanisms. And then in chapter 2, also introducing some tracking and evaluation, but how to track and evaluate biodiversity investments. Want to understand why transparency accountability is important, especially in biodiversity finance, and also have a quick look, a brief look about different tools and frameworks. And then in chapter 3, what we will do is that we try to bridge the science and finance for strategic impact, looking at, again, like a few approaches and frameworks which are helpful for different purposes related to biodiversity-related investments. So with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Michael König. He's, as I mentioned already, Senior Project Manager at the Frankfurt School, UNEP Collaborating Center for Climate and Sustainable Energy Finance. And yeah, Michael, really happy, also for myself, very interesting. Looking forward to see what can you repeat already, share with us concerning the upcoming State of Nature Finance 2025. Michael.
Thank you very much, Jonas. So basically, you likely know that there are 3 Rio Conventions in place that has been founded in the 90s. So that's on the one side, the UNFCCC focusing on mitigating impacts of climate change. There's the UNCBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework published or like endorsed in 2022. And there's also a 3rd convention, which is like the UNCCD. It's the Convention on removing desertification and land drought. So this is more on like land management and topics. So in these 3 conventions, they has been used, they has been developed quite in an isolated manner in the recent decades and years. There has not been much about like interlinkages and exchanges and forums between the 3 secretariats. So they also they set up strategies and regulations for member states. As you know, like all know the national determined contributions from the UNFCCC. Some of you likely know also the national biodiversity strategic action plans, the NB-subs, and also there's land degradation targets for the UNCCD. So there has been isolated strategies and requirements and targets set out to by governments. And what we identified in the recent years, and this is not this is not the rocket science, is basically that there are a certain set of economic activities and technologies in place that can contribute to each of the convention in parallel. And though this is a very strong argument from an economic perspective on one side, right? If you can utilize like one invested dollar to get like a financial outcome of like an economic value of like $3, but multiplied by 3 because it serves for even more for different financial reporting mandates on the different conventions. It has a really beauty in fostering these technologies and economic activities. Also, because like countries more and more consolidate public domestic finance in the space of climate change and biodiversity, it is of more relevant to look into activities with like a strong leverage point, and you get a lot out of these so-called nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation measures that are all in the larger, broader set of biodiversity finance located. So to give you some examples, and you will get more details on in the slides that Jonas and Fabian will present to you later. But just to illustrate more what we are trying to demonstrate in the next edition of the State of Finance for Nature edition, which will be published in October 2025, is that there are activities that are very, very costly to make it more relevant. So what are these activities, right? So to give you some examples, it's basically, for instance, it's green roofing and urban green spaces versus conventional air conditioning. So it's already more cost effective to plant trees in urban spaces and in cities and on facades of buildings and roofs than to install and maintain conventional air conditionings, which also comes with negative impacts when it comes to emissions and so on. But this is one example. Other examples are mangrove restoration in coastal areas. So there's also already many academic studies that are proven cost effectiveness. And the point is on effectiveness, what you can really reach with like an invested dollar on coastal protection if you invest like in mangroves and in other nature-based ecosystems on the coastal areas compared to concrete, hard walls, seawalls in the conventional adaptation space so far. So sand filtering measures, seabed sand filtering measures, another case where you see that you get similar with less harmful negative side event results from water filtering, natural water filtering, instead of like conventional chemical-based water cleaning stations. So this is also another example where like nature-based solutions are really utilizing and materializing when we're speaking about biodiversity finance. It's not only about like protecting areas to avoid deforestation, for instance. So it's really the way that in the space of nature-based solutions is about to identify business models, right, where the private sector can play like a good role and leverage further capital in that space. So this is like just an introduction to why this is very relevant and what the State of Finance for Nature report will spin out. For sure, it's like it has like also like updated estimates on like finance flows in dedicated sectors from domestic and public international sources. It focuses also like on private sector mechanisms and sources to enrich the discussion and debate about already existing measures that could be leveraged much more because they have proven good, very cost effectiveness. To name a few, it's like payments for ecosystem services is a very important one, where there's like a financing mechanisms where some parts of the population get like compensated for the provisioning of basically also for like the extraction of natural resources like water from rural areas flowing into through in areas of urban settlements, and these persons and residents living in these urban areas will compensate directly the ones from the rural sites. So payments of ecosystem services are very important. Then we have like biodiversity offsets is also a very, very important mechanism that helps the private sector to identify impact driven activities where they really can show that they increase the physical metrics, like the increased, the decreased emissions, the reduced area of land deforestation, and so on. So these private finance mechanisms are very, very crucial. Finally, and I look also to you, Jonas, to give me a sign by when I should also wrap up in a way. So just let me continue briefly with like another section in the report, which was very relevant, is to shed light on basically investment needs, right? which is okay, what is needed to meet the targets of the Rio conventions. And here there will be like updated numbers from a quantitative perspective using like integrated assessment models and so on. But also emphasize like a strong focus on more qualitative investment and financing needs. This is quite important because usually in these technical quantitative calculations, they come up with like the investment needs mostly. So what is like the capex, the ticket size of the capex, and what is the cost for maintenance? But what they usually ignore are several layers that are relevant in the financing needs discussion. And this is basically like soft cost investments. So you can really write that term down because this is a very important one. So what are basically the transaction costs, the soft costs that are needed to bring a project and technology on the financial close for commercial operation? So this is basically like a range from around 2 to 10% of the project costs are dedicated to piloting, to demonstration, to legal aspects, to capacity building for stakeholders, for environmental impact assessment. So that's basically investment needs that are usually not being considered as relevant in investment needs analysis. And it's also not that super important to peg like a number on it. So how much dollar is it at the end? But it's much more important to bring it to an awareness in the market that these costs are super relevant, and that investors do not need to invent or like to investigate on a very individual basis the total costs at the end, but there's more structured and more standardized ways to also cover these soft cost investments that are needed to realize projects basically. And so this is quite a big topic that will roll out in the next edition, and it wraps up basically with a more like tangible set of leverage points and entry points for different actors to ensure, okay, so what do I need to do in my role? What can I do to foster the economic transformations towards more like a nature positive economy? I'm stopping here and remain available for questions. So even if it's now already some questions in the room, I'm happy to take on these. And otherwise, please let me know once I shall also contribute further to the session. Yeah, Jonas, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Michael, for providing already the first insights into the upcoming report. I would suggest we take now a few questions in case there is anything. Just use the chat or just activate your microphone or maybe your camera as well if you have any direct question to Michael and to his intervention, and then then after that we continue. Are there any direct questions to Michael?
Still also starting a review process on the draft in mid July. So the second order draft before publication, and in case of interest for in a reviewer capacity we could also bring you in the loop to get like a draft on it and provide you feedback on it. So I'm just offering it to this dedicated group of people. So let me just know if there's interest to review. We can see. Otherwise, I remain, as said, available during the meeting.
Great. Thank you so much. If there's not a question, we would suggest we continue. So what we have planned now, as I said, like as the beginning, like we would like to start like discussion about like understanding like the biodiversity finance ecosystem. We will have you will see that some of the concepts which also Michael has just touched upon, we will try like to explore in a bit more detail. But maybe before we start with that, let's quickly recap And maybe like just like an article, it's already quite a few years ago, so 2020, which really was discussing like the role of bees, for example, as a hugely important biodiversity as well as the economy. And let's kick off like with like having a recap why about the dependency on nature. So what do you think? If you think about like a bee colony, like beehive, what do you think? What is the value created by a bee? Just one single beehive. What would be your suggestion? You can write it in US dollars, in euros, whatever. Write it in the chat. What is the value generated by one bee colony? One beehive. Just write it in the chat. What would be your estimate? There's no right and wrong. Just write your estimates in the chat. Again, what is the value created by one bee colony? Yes, any number. Just write it in the chat, please. Then we have like some guesses. Any guess? Write any random number that you have at least like, yeah, 1 euro. Okay, we start with 1 euro. What else? Any other estimation? No, Evelyn, very good. 75 of food produce. 10,000 euro. Okay, good. And if you talk about, for example, like this was a really good guess. So it's in between 1 and 10,000. I have to say. But what do you think? Looking at about like the overall animal or insect pollination, what would be the value of that? What do you think? So if you're talking not about one individual bee colony, but we are talking about like animal pollination in general, there's also associated value to that. What do you think for in general? What be the value? What would be the value? The value of animal pollination annually. We're not talking about one beehive now, but globally 200,000 millions per year. Yeah, it's already good estimate. Ms. Velasquez. So if you have a deeper look, I will tell you. So like the pollination value of a bee colony is between 800 and 900 euros. But if we, as you said, like sum up, and these values are a bit old, but I think there might be, but this is the latest we found. If you look at the value of animal pollination as overall, it's more than 500 billion US dollars. So really a significant amount. Also, in fact, that there's 1% of global GDP is also directly linked to the work of bees and pollinators. So it is really, I would say, really striking, especially when you think about how small and also sometimes how overlooked insects especially are. You remember we had the discussion last session as well about the role of insects, especially for pollination services as well. But on the other hand, there's something paradox as well. Because if you look at just OECD countries investing more like 100 billion US dollars per year to environmentally or to investments that are not really environmentally friendly, but really which is often subsidies and which support intensive farming methods, for example, degraded habitats, or even threaten the pollinator populations. So yeah, this is what the first aspect. The second aspect, sometimes we just say no, that we take nature benefits as really granted, but really if you choose this, we all depend on ecosystem services, right? And if you look at businesses, I think the dependency is really critical for businesses, and there are roughly 44 trillion US dollars. It is equally of more or less 55% of the global GDP. It's moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. So that means more than half of the global economy is at risk if ecosystem services, ecosystems continue to degrade and biodiversity is getting lost. They also, as other people say, or at least if you look at businesses, I think 100% of businesses are dependent on ecosystem services. But this are some figures which I think quite a few have heard already earlier. If you talk about the loss of biodiversity alone, we could estimate that if you look at the global economy, it's up to $2.7 trillion US. It's not like only environmental issues; it's really like a massive economic liability that we have. And if you don't look only at the GDP level, we also, if you look at nature directly supported, this is really supporting directly also people's lives. So between 1 and 1.5 billion people are relying, for example, on forests for food, for fuel, for livelihoods. And as you have already heard by Michael as well, most of these are vulnerable communities, for example, which are making biodiversity loss not only an economic issue but also a social issue as well. As I said, one could really say that 100% of businesses are somehow dependent on nature, and this is like what we can see here, for example, the comparison by the World Economic Forum, where we're distinguishing between direct and direct dependency or even dependency through or via the supply chain. And if we're talking about direct dependency, this includes some sectors like as forestry or agriculture, fisheries, which are shown in red. So really have a really high dependency. Meanwhile, for example, real estate or mining metals, etc., have a right. And if you're talking about the direct dependency or the medium, and other sectors which might be low. But if you talk about the supply chain, then we see it a bit different. And also even sectors such as electronics are also have quite a strong medium dependency on nature. And just think about all the minerals, which are natural resources, which are needed to be used for developing and producing electronics. So this is really showing that there's a high dependency. On the other hand, also insurance sectors are starting like to estimate and looking at the different sectors and also especially like their dependency on nature. So this graph is really showing on the x-axis like the dependency on ecosystem services, and on the other hand, the overall nature-related risks that industries are facing, and they divide it in between like a danger zone, which is just saying like a business operations may be severely disrupted by diversity loss or nature-related loss. Then we have a critical zone, which is business might moderately disrupted, and there's a rather safe zone. So that you can really see here, for example, that especially sectors like the agriculture, fishery, but also tourism, travel, hospitality are really like in the danger zone and really with a high dependency on ecosystem services. While, for example, on the other hand, the only two which are estimated via the insurance sector to be in the safe zone are in this case media entertainment as well as telecommunication IT. But we have also just learned that there are also some other aspects which are important. So another aspect, quickly like to recap, when we're talking about the impact on the nature, there are different drivers of biodiversity loss. We have introduced them already last time, so maybe we quickly collect what are they. So write it in the chat, what are the different drivers of biodiversity loss? Who remembers a few of them? There in total there were 5. You remember last time that we discussed there were the big 5, so to say. The big 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. Which are they? Climate change, Evelyn, very good. Yeah. What else? Land use change. Yes. Pollution, exactly. Invasive species, yes. And which was the last one? Deforestation. Yeah, this deforestation, Rodrigo, exactly. This is related to direct over-exploitation in this case. No, not directly deforestation, but that. And you can see here and exactly here the other the 5. Thank you so much for participating. And you can really see that that really there are some industries, especially in the primary sector, looking at farming, but also and fishing and forestry has like a really strong impact or extreme impact on biodiversity loss, for example, in land use and land and sea use change, but as well as in over-exploitation, if you're talking about fishing, right? As well as in forestry. So very good examples that we recall that they are, depending on the human activities, economic activities, they have a very strong impact on the different drivers which lead to biodiversity loss. Then it's another aspect as well. We talk about I think what's also important to understand that our demand, which we have in different countries, and also like our way of living, and as well is also one of the drivers of biodiversity loss. And this map is showing this as an example, but we could also apply this to other countries. In this case, we are talking only about the total European Union imports of different resources such as wheat, shrimp, palm oil, rubber, timber, beef, and soy. And just give an example, like for example, the Pampas region here in Argentina supply 24% of the EU soy import, and also if we combine this together with Brazil's Cerrado, contributes another 13%. So, for example, soy production in these areas are leading really the cause of deforestation in many cases, as well as a land conversion. So, like the demand in Europe in this case is contributing to biodiversity loss somewhere else. So, this is a similar example could be, for example, if you look at Indonesia, Malaysia are the major sources of palm oil production and export. And together account for 20% of Europe's imports. So that also mean palm oil, as you might know, is also a key driver for tropical forest loss. So this has, and there are other examples as well. On the other hand, what we also see, looking at an example from China, and China is really facing significant economic risk from biodiversity loss and natural disasters. 65% of China's GDP, which is roughly 9.3 million trillion, is a risk of disruption, with over half of it classified as high or medium risk. And especially this is important for the agriculture and food and beverage sector, but also in transport, energy, etc. Okay, someone was mentioning unable to hear. Okay, this has been cleared. And thank you so much for providing already an example. Yeah, sea use change, like shrimp farms, but also other like type of fisheries that would be like sea use change, though, like not destroying natural habitats, coral reefs, etc. for other economic activities. This would be an example for that. Yeah, thank you so much already for having also these lively discussions already in the chat.
Can I say something about
Yes,
the last slide, the previous slide? That also demand can be a driver for conservation, because like, for example, here in Honduras, our coffee farmers are actually very worried because with the new EU regulations on stopping deforestation, they have to guarantee that their coffee farms have not caused further deforestation from a given year up to now. And that means they have to have records with satellites and GIS systems, which are not available for all of our coffee farmers that might be engaged in good coffee that goes exported, to the EU.
Yeah.
So demand can also be a powerful tool for conservation as well.
Exactly. Yeah, not totally right. I would agree definitely with you, Evelyn. So yeah, both sides are considered. But if we're talking in this case, first of all, like about general like drivers for biodiversity loss, and this is definitely one of the drivers of the demand. And also what I wanted to show you with this slide is that because in comparison to climate change, we often discuss biodiversity and biodiversity loss only very locally, but they are international and global dependencies and relations, and that is what I wanted quickly to show you. But I would also totally agree with you. Also, like the idea would then be like to revert that, right? To create a demand which is then nature or biodiversity positive. So it's a good example. Thank you so much. Then also, like when we're talking about policy or decision making, I think what is helpful also is we understand different scenarios. In this case, talking about the baseline scenario, which is actually presenting not the legislation in action approach. So this area here is essentially continuing with business as usual. And on the other hand, we can also see if we are looking really like for different scenarios, which, for example, in the camp of forest and landscape restoration, which involves, for example, proactive interventions, for example, aimed at restoring and degraded lands and ecosystem. They have directly an impact also on nature systems. In this case, if you look about the baseline scenario, so really in action, then we will experience most likely a continued degradation of soil and ecosystems. While on the other hand, if we are talking about another scenarios, which we also might be consider for example, decision making, etc. We can also talk about improved biophysical structures. For example, now we have there's better agroforestry systems in place, but also improving the ecosystem functions. For example, not generated organic soil, water supply, and water retention, etc. And as we have discussed last time, all the different services which are provided by ecosystems also directly have a strong impact on human well-being, right? So if you're talking about the baseline scenario, we have really looking at a cost of land degradation while we are really investing and in for example, in this case, as an example, forest and landscape restoration. It also creates a lot of other benefits, such as contributing to food security for farmers. We have additional income, but also creates an added value, for example, like a market value of the crop harvest, for example, which could be as a result for that. Another example would be is the total economic value framework, which I quickly want to don't do detail, but it's also like a good tool in order to see how value of ecosystem services or the benefit and to understand the full range of benefits ecosystem services are providing. So on the one hand, we are talking about the use value, which are benefits which you derive from actual potential use of nature. So for example, direct use value is really including consumptive uses like timber or crops or fuel wood. And then talking also non-consumptive uses like recreation and tourism. This could also be part of that. Then indirect use value would mean that we have refers to functional benefits. Functional benefits of ecosystems are providing. We are talking about soil erosion control, water regulation, nutrient cycling. I think we have discussed it in the previous session already. So these services are support delivery of goods and services indirectly. And last but not least, we are talking also about option values, which are capturing the value of preserving ecosystems of future use by either ourselves or future generations. And on the other hand, these are the use values, but there are also a lot of other non-use values. So here we're talking about existence values, which are just values for people or we as people are placing on simply knowing that, for example, a species or ecosystem exists, even we have never used them. This is then there are different methods which can be measured with that. But at the end, if you look at the applicable restoration benefits, then we can distinguish between private benefits. So really have market value like the crops and timbers, as I've mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, we are talking also about public benefits. So the non-market values, which is in this case, have a regulated climate, have future recreational opportunities as well. So I think this is like I just like to really wanted to frame this because it's like a framework which is essential for informed decision making about ecosystem. When you're talking about ecosystem restoration, or do we want to do conservation or sustainable land use, that there are also visible but also hidden values we are accounting for. Then also very briefly discussing, and I have mentioned already a few, there are different approaches and tools which are there in order to estimate the economic value of ecosystem services. So, for example, we're talking about the production function method, which is just including estimates how much an ecosystem service contributes to the production of another good service that is traded in the market. For example, we can talk about, again, like we call the example of pollination that affects the crop yields. Market price method would mean in this case that there uses directly existing market prices which are there in the market to value the ecosystem services and the goods and the services. The travel cost method is a bit more, goes a bit to a different direction because it's useful, especially for evaluating recreational sites. Just assuming, for example, that they are, it assumes, for example, that the time and the money people are spending to visit for a natural site site is reflecting its value. So not, again, like if people are traveling to a certain area to visit a natural site or like to visit a hotspot, and also the money they would spend to go there, this is reflecting the value. This is the method saying. Other methods, in this case, for example, hedonic pricing would mean looks at, for example, how environmental attributes, for example, the scenic view in the spot or the air quality affect the prices or related to markets and goods, such as, for example, in real estate. This is quite frequently used. And then we are talking about contingent valuation, which involves likely asking people through service, for example, and this research like to do that, how much they would be willing to pay to preserve or enhance the ecosystem. And with that, they would, or even how much compensation they would require for its loss. And on the other hand, also joint analyzed choice experiment is something similar, goes with a similar direction. Then respondents are confronted with different hypothetical scenarios or bundle of ecosystem attributes, and they have to do some, like a choice experiment, to do some choices, and based on the choices, then the value would be estimated. And last but not least, there are two other approaches. I don't want to go into much into detail. It's just like replacement cost. It's just like saying how much it would cost to replace an ecosystem service which has been lost. And avoided damage is just meaning that you look at the expenses, expenses that we can avoid by maintaining ecosystem services. So it's just like, one is like replacement, the other one is like upfront, so have to avoidance. Just like to really have like from economic modeling perspective or economic economic perspective, a quick like introduction to that aspect. And now we would like to go back to Slido, and I think Michael has mentioned it already a few. So and we just quickly collected. So in the context of biodiversity and nature finance, what are the key international frameworks that underpin and drive financial efforts, and especially in the financial industry? Just type again, scan the QR code, or go to slido.com, and then let's quickly collect a few so that we, you can also put in the chat. I think we can use both sides, but it would be also nice that it's visual for everyone, that we're using the Slido questions, and then we continue from there. So remember, when you think about, okay, there's someone participating already, very good. UNFCCC, exactly, no, climate change, we had just discussed. Just wait a few seconds. CBD, GBF, exactly, not mentioned by the Biodiversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Anything else? I think there's one which I would like to address, which is missing. No? Okay. Oh no, task. Okay, there should be task force for climate for nature-related financial disclosure. Good. As you have mentioned earlier, I think UNCCD, exactly. One framework is still missing, which I wanted to let to TCFD. Okay, what else? There's one missing. Specification, yeah, CCD. Good. No, very good. Yeah, actually, these are the most of the important ones, but was just this was we just waited. There's someone else typing. Yeah, it's coming out of photo. Okay, very good. You have a lot of different frameworks, but I wanted to quickly like to raise the attention, and similar to what Michael has said at the beginning, we also can talk about the SDGs as a global framework, right? Because there are several SDGs in this case, addressing biodiversity-related issues, and we have discussed it in the earlier session and the first session already. And I think it's very important, like to look at different different frameworks in order to see how they are contributing in order to foster investments, especially in, we talk about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also diversity positive gains, and to have with the overall objective in this case, if you're talking about biodiversity, to have full recovery by 2050. I think these frameworks are helpful, and you can also be, if you want now to define what is sustainable finance, what is biodiversity finance, what it is, it's also helpful to have these in mind, because just wanted to show you here, because everything is more or less related to each other, right? And this is just like a simplified way of how we can cluster different when we're talking about the different concepts about, for example, biodiversity finance. But let's start from the overall perspective. So we're talking about sustainable development goals, where we have the 4 different dimensions. Then talking about, for example, about the objectives of the Paris Agreement, climate change mitigation, adaptation, talking about climate finance or even low carbon finance or something, other technologies which you might there. And then we have not other environmental objectives, such as the global biodiversity framework. Then we're talking about, this case, only about biodiversity finance. Nature finance, you would see it a bit more like a bit more broader concept of nature-based solutions, for example. It's also including other environmental aspects, as well as could also contribute to climate change adaptation if you want to do so. And then green finance is just covering all the E part, and then at the end also sustainable finance, really covering, especially as it has been discussed already. I think everyone is aware of that, about the ESG dimensions. Michael has already introduced also like the concept of nature-based solutions, and let's quickly also see what are they, and also like in comparison to other definitions which are out there. So nature-based solutions are really like actions not aimed to protect, on the one hand, restore and sustainably manage ecosystems. Doesn't matter whether they're terrestrial, freshwater, or coastal or marine. And the purpose of these actions is to address a wide range of societal, economic, environmental challenges, as we have heard, so climate change, but also disaster risk and food security. But I think it's also important that we just recap what the other concepts say. So biodiversity finance is looking at the expenditures contributing or intends to contribute to conservation, sustained use, and restoration of biodiversity. While climate finance is, on the one hand, is managed and also mobilized to reducing emissions on the one hand, but also increasing resilience or adaptation efforts. And on the other hand, and then the last concept of restoration finance is actually saying, or it refers to process of halting and reversing degradation, resulting in improved ecosystem services and recovered biodiversity. So has already like some other dimensions in there. On the other hand, I think it's also interesting to see where the differences and the overlaps are, because I think we have to be, and you will see it later as well, if you want to track, for example, a certain investment, it's important to understand what other differences are, and especially also what the overlaps are. So this is important, especially if you want to then design sound policies and also do your investment planning. So, for example, with biodiversity finance, many of the activities are aligned with nature-based solutions. But on the other hand, there are overlaps, as I said, use of nature to protect biodiversity is overlapping with the NBS framework. But for example, not all of activities to protect and restore biodiversity are activities are nature-based solutions necessarily. In climate finance, I think it's more easier to detect the differences. On the one hand, the overlaps, yes, definitely there might be nature-based solutions which could be used in order to mitigate climate change impacts. For example, when you're talking about, for example, mangroves for coastal protection or afforestation for carbon sequestration. So these are definitely nature-based solutions. So the nature-based solutions that are contributing, or it could also be labeled as climate finance. And the differences between nature-based solutions and restoration finance. In this case, restoration is one in the set of NBS, but it's not always that restoration is needs to be nature-based solutions for that. No, Michael has mentioned one example, but I also like soil remediation, for example, using chemicals, machinery, concrete, flood barrier for concrete for flood barriers to support ecological recovery. They're not nature-based, but they're contributing to restoration. So we would like to now so after like recapping the different concepts, we would quickly like to discuss with you what are maybe quick quiz. So again, please activate your Slido, and so you have to decide now for the next next question. Or first of all, please everyone join the quiz. So scan the QR code again, and then we have like a few questions we would like to discuss with you, and just wait a few seconds until everyone has joined the quiz. So far we have 0 participants joining the quiz. Let's wait a few seconds. Evelyn, very good. You're already there. Perfect. Very good. So in the quiz, maybe meanwhile you're trying to log in. So what you have to decide, there are different statements, different projects. And you have to decide, is it a nature-based solutions based on that I just presented, or is it a climate solution? Again, is it a nature-based solution or is it a climate solution? So we wait a few more seconds that more participants can join. We have 31 participants. 8 of you have joined so far. So there's still some room for improvement. So please join, scan the QR code. We close in 5 seconds. Okay, good. As I said, you have to decide now, are the following examples, are they nature-based solutions or are they climate solutions? Let's have a first look at the first one. A city turns an abandoned railway into a green corridor with native plants to cool the urban environment and create recreational space. Is it a nature-based solution or is it the climate solution? It's just like a bit of recapping what we just said, like to look, okay, you understand the concepts, because for some of you are very familiar with this already, but for some of you might also be new. So with that, we have like a good sign of 7 of 10 have participated already. So there are 8. We'll get a few more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Yeah, 78% says it's a nature-based solution. 22 of you says it's a climate solution. And it's a nature-based solution in this case because the main purpose is we like to provide recreational space, and also like the main objective is not really to mitigate, for example, climate, but really like to enhance biodiversity and with nature-based solutions. So this is the reason why it's a nature-based solution. 78% of you have it correct. Good. Let's have a look at the next one. An agri-tech company develops drought-resistant maize seeds to reduce crop failure under climate stress. Is it a nature-based solution or a climate solution? Seven of 10 have responded. Very fast, very good. 8. And 10 of 10, very good. Let's have a look. Yes, 90% say it's a climate solution, 10% say it's a nature-based solution, and let's reveal it. So it's a climate solution, no? Because in this case, if the agri-tech company is developing drought-resistant maize, so that to be more resilient against climate stress and climate change impacts, so it's what could be even labeled as a adaptation measure in this case. Yeah, very good. Next one, a government pays farmers to maintain hedgerows and forest patches for pollination and carbon storage. Climate solution or nature-based solution? Four of 10. Sometimes they're very tricky. They could even, yeah, don't say further. 8 of 10. 10 of 10. yeah, 90% say it's a nature-based solution, and this is also correct. No, because especially the main purpose here would be pollination, for pollination purposes, and we're talking about maintaining hedgerows and forest patches. So this would be in this case a nature-based solution. This is good. And last but not least, a remote community replaces diesel generators with off-grid wind turbines to low emission and improve energy access. I think this is easy. So I hope 100% now. Let's see. Eight of 11. 9 of 11. So we give it 2 seconds. 1 and great. 2. Yeah, 100%. Very good. Well done. So yeah, this is definitely a climate solution. I think this was very good. So very good. Thank you so much for participating with that. We have even a leaders board. So Mauricio, congratulations, Mauricio. You did everything and in 49 seconds, just 1 second ahead of Evelyn, also Ghislaine, Barbara, Nicolo. Very good. Thank you so much for participating, everyone as well. So with that, I will then hand over and to Fabian so that we can start with looking at the current status of biodiversity natural-related investments and financing. Fabian?
Thank you, Jonas. So yeah, let's start with a common understanding of financial flows in the context of biodiversity. So financial flows refer to the movement of money for various purposes, including investment, subsidies, and expenditures. So these flows can significantly impact biodiversity either by supporting conservation efforts or by contributing to biodiversity loss. So in this context, positive financial flows are investments and funding that support conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of natural resources. And these flows aim to enhance biodiversity and ecosystem services through various initiatives. So here we have, for example, protected areas and conservation projects, reforestation and afforestation, sustainable agriculture, and overall funding for a nature-based solution that somehow was discussed. Next one, please. And on the other hand, negative financial flows are those that harm biodiversity. So these include subsidies for activities that lead to habitat destruction, pollution, and overexploitation of resources. So such financial flows can accelerate the biodiversity loss and degrade different ecosystems. So here we have, for example, deforestation or overfishing, pollution, intensive industries, environmental harm subsidies. The next one, please. And now let's discuss the investment gaps and needs in the area of biodiversity. So for this, let's take a look at the figures provided in the 2023 State of Nature report by the United Nations. So wrapping up what was shared by Michael at the beginning. So this report estimates the scale of nature negative financial flows from both public and private sector sources globally, and tracks finance flows to nature-based solutions as well. And then it helps to compare them to the finance needed to maximize the potential of nature-based solutions. So here we can see an overview of the finance flows, including the finance flows to nature-based solutions, which amounts to around 200 billion, for which 82% comes from the government and 18% comes from the private sector. We will dig more about it in the next slides. And we can also see the finance flows with direct negative impacts on nature, so around 7 trillion, including the public finance flows with 1.7 trillion, and public funding to environmental harmful subsidies, which is 10 times bigger than the public finance flows, and a 55% increase from the values estimated in 2021. So it's really interesting to see all these figures all together and being able to compare what the situation is. We can also see the private finance flows with negative impacts, accounting to 5 trillion, which is 140 times bigger than the private finance flows to nature-based solutions. Next one, please. And now let's take a look at the public nature negative finance. So as mentioned, this is 10 times higher than public nature positive finance and includes public funding to environmental harmful subsidies in agriculture, fossil fuels, fisheries, and forestry. So here it is important to highlight that globally, fossil fuels subsidies to consumers saw a dramatic increase from 563 billion in 2021 to 1.16 trillion in 2022. So this surge was primarily driven by efforts to protect consumers from high fossil fuel prices due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And additionally, there was an extra spending to lower energy costs in 2022, with around 350 billion of that amount spent in Europe. So this increase in subsidies, particularly for gas and electricity, was concentrated in emerging markets and developing economies. So here we can see the variability of fossil fuel subsidies over time, which reflects the impact of high fossil fuel prices and the global energy crisis, for which, like governments continue to, in a way, prioritize shielding consumers over phasing out subsidies, which slows in a way the transition to renewable energy and absorbs scarce public funds. The next one, please. And in terms of public negative finance, subsidies in agriculture include price incentives and fiscal transfers that often encourage practices that are harmful to biodiversity. So here we have, for instance, monoculture farming and excessive use of fertilizers or pesticides. Subsidies for fossil fuels support also like the consumption of oil, electricity, gas, and coal, leading to increased greenhouse gas emissions, habitat destruction, or pollution. In terms of fisheries, we have the financial support, which is usually for the capacity of fish that exceeds sustainable levels, which in a way also foster the depleting of fish stocks, for forestry subsidies, for logging and timber. So overall, track nature negative public finance flows reached around 1.7 trillion in 2022. And nature negative public finance flows are more than 10 times greater than public finance flows for nature-based solutions. And in 2022, roughly 90% of tracked negative public flows were directed towards energy and agriculture. So in this figure, we can see how fossil fuel subsidies to consumers are highly variable over time. The doubling of subsidies between 2021 and 2022 should be seen in the context of the very high fossil price resulting from the Russian invasion, as I already mentioned. But nevertheless, somehow like the evidence also suggests that governments continue to prioritize shielding consumers over phasing out subsidies in the context of high and volatile fossil fuel prices. And this disconnect between governments, climate and nature pledges, and fossil fuels production and associated subsidies is a major driver of the persistence of very large nature negative finance flows, as somehow we can see here. So to sum up, let's keep in mind that in addition to absorbing limited fiscal resources, poorly designed subsidies can also incentivize behaviors that will be harmful for nature. So price incentives for certain products, let's say beef, rice, or milk, using different fiscal subsidies like coupled subsidies, are also known to have a potential for negative impact on nature. Next one, please. And in terms of negative private flows, let's keep in mind that they are 140 times higher than private nature positive finance, and include different sectors like transport and infrastructure, metals and mining, oil and gas, real estate, or electric utilities and independent power producers. Next one, please. So to highlight, and without entering into a lot of details due to time, here we can see that finance activities in the industrial sector, for instance, have highly negative impacts, with around 1.4 trillion contributing to air and soil pollution and the clearing of natural habitats. And these activities contribute significantly to air and soil pollution. For example, manufacturing process often release harmful pollutants into the environment. The construction industry can lead to the clearing of natural habitats for developing projects. So here we have examples of industries such as steel production, cement manufacturing, chemical processing, which are major contributors to environmental degradation. Next one. We can also see that direct finance flows into consumer non-cyclicals are smaller, so they are only at 8% of the total nature negative finance, but this sector generates large nature negative impacts. So here we include food, agriculture, forestry, and fishing. These are related to water pollution, for instance, from fertilizers and pesticides, or overfishing and depletion in fish and stock. Next one. And in terms of the 5 top industries, we can see that construction and engineering, electric utilities and independent power producers, real estate operations, oil and gas, and food and tobacco receive 43% of nature negative financial flows, but they represent only 16% of the total private investment flow. So it's a really interesting figure. Next one. And now we can move on to the finance flows towards nature-based solutions. In this figure, we can see that public finance remains the predominant source of funding for nature-based solutions, accounting for 82% of the total finance flows, including protection for biodiversity and landscape, sustainable agriculture, forestry and fishing, water resources, or pollution abatement. And in terms of private finance for nature-based solutions, this remains at a modest 18% of the total financial flow, with more of half being channeled through biodiversity offset and credits and sustainable finance supply chains. Next one, please. So in this figure, we can see that the total traceable finance flows to nature-based solutions in 2022 increased by 11% relative to the previous year. And this increase is largely attributable to a really large 17 billion increase in public funding of nature-based solutions, almost half of which through increase for sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And here's important also to highlight that this increase was driven by post-COVID-19, so like the build back better spending and targeted conservation spending by the US Department of Agriculture. And in fact, 76% of these finance flows for sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fishing were coming from China, the US, Canada, Japan, and Turkey. So a significant increase in one of these countries can have an impact and can be really reflected in global estimates like those. And also, as noted earlier, the largest share of public nature-based solutions finance goes towards the protection of biodiversity and landscapes, which is like an increase of 7% from the previous year, which is also really, really interesting. Next one, please. Here we can see an overview of the funding for biodiversity protection as a share of national budgets, where less than 1% of national budgets were spent on biodiversity protection. And it's important to highlight that more than half of the global finance to tackle biodiversity loss, it's originating in 5 countries, so the US, France, Italy, China, and Germany. So the global increase is related to increased spending in the US on wildlife conservation and in the EU under biodiversity strategy to 2030, but we have to remember that those figures are for 2023, so this might have changed due to political reasons in the US, for example. And China has also a significant expenditure policy on biodiversity with roughly 35 billion spent since 2017. So it's also really interesting to bear in mind. The next one, please. And here we can see the private finance flows to nature-based solutions by channel. So we can highlight that total private nature-based solutions finance was estimated at around 35 billion in 2022, which was representing 18% of the total nature-based solutions finance globally. And half, around 57% of private finance flows were via biodiversity offsets and credits and sustainable supply chains. So while small in absolute numbers, so the fastest growth was seen in philanthropy, so that was 39% increase. And private finance also by the official assistance development, so 31% increase. And that was via blended finance deal. So for example, here we have blue bonds or the rhino bonds. And so in terms of sustainable supply chains, we have that private investments here provide the second largest finance flows at around 8.6 billion in 2022. So here, sustainable supply chain certifications are a major market with a third of cocoa and half of coffee production under some sustainability certifications. And here we can see that the demand is increasing. So these figures will most probably increase in the upcoming years. And the direct investments of farmers into conservation agriculture are providing a further 1.5 billion per annum. So this brings total finance flows to sustainable agriculture to 10.1 per annum for this year, which is a very impressive figure. Still, it needs a lot. There is a lot of work to be done, but it's a very promising figure. The next one, please. And now let's move to how much investment in nature-based solution is really needed to use the potential of ecosystems to reach real conservation targets. So these targets, let's remember, include limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees, halting biodiversity loss by ensuring that at least 30% of land and sea is protected by 2030, and by achieving land degradation neutrality by 2030. So in this context, investment needs are calculated for different types of nature-based solutions, suggesting how much money needs to be invested and where. And further granularity analysis by region provides information of different needs and opportunities for protected areas, ecosystem restoration, for sustainable land management. We can check that in the next slide. But for context, based on modeling of potential financial returns on nature-based solutions, this figure here shows the estimates for the likely relative share of public and private finance for nature-based solutions over time. So we see investment needs are compared to current financial flows to estimate in a way the gap or the current gap in finance and what it's needed. So annual financial flows to nature-based solutions need to be more than double by 2025. So from 200 billions to roughly 436 billion, and nearly triple to 542 billion by 2030 to reach climate, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. So here it's important to highlight that the nature-based solutions included in the analysis are grouped into three categories, as we can see here in the slide. So we have sustainable land management, restoration, and protection. And while this is a very pragmatic grouping that supports analysis and policy development, the distinction between these categories or the subcategories, it's in a way artificial because like there is a lot of overlap between them, but it's a really nice way to like graphically see and to discuss, to have political discussions about the importance of this. And for instance, sustainable land management here. So sustainable land management investments are needed or based on the potential expansion of agroforestry, cover of crops, or optimal grazing and intensity of different sort of sustainable practices. Next one, please. So in the following slides, we can see the estimates for additional investment needs per region. But like here, we would like to maybe ask if you have a guess or have an estimate in mind, like which region do you think needs the most investment from private and public sources for nature-based solutions? Just an estimate that you say like, okay, maybe this region really needs a lot of investments. Yeah, you can write your estimate or your guess in the chat. So yeah, again, it's just which region do you think needs the most investment from private and public sources for nature-based solutions? If you think maybe it's Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Okay, I think we can move. So here we can see per region, what are the additional nature-based solutions investment needs. For instance, in the Middle East and reforming economies, we can see somehow how are the needs for the estimates for 2030 and 2050. We see that, for instance, in this region, like the priority will be like agroforestry. And we can see the difference, like for Rio aligned 323 billion, which roughly 180 billion will be invested for agriculture in Russia and Kazakhstan. Next one. So for Oceania, we have, for instance, again, like agroforestry and investments required for agriculture, for nature-based solutions potential of agriculture. For instance, in Australia, including soil, organic carbon, or key mitigation measures. For the next region, we have North America. Here we have protected areas and agroforestry. So we have, for instance, that Canada is already committing certain amount of money for it, for reaching their goals for 2030. For the next region, we have Europe, agroforestry, already certain goals set for 2030, which is really good. We have Africa, agroforest Africa, about the deforestation and protected areas, low-cost protected areas, and about it, deforestation is like a key priority at the moment, or that's what it's envisioned for the coming decades. For Latin America, the priority will be reforestation, particularly because deforestation is a key issue in the region. We have Asia, which is the largest of all of them. So we have here like that the priority is reforestation and agroforestry, with commitments for 2050, which are really consistent and quite ambitious, especially by China and by India. And finally, let's briefly discuss about who will finance the required investments in nature-based solutions. So, like in recent years, there has been a strong push for the private sector to increase funding for biodiversity restoration and climate action. So given perceived limits to the ability of governments to increase direct public investments. And while, like both public and private nature-based solutions, finance flows are likely to steeply increase by 2050, private sources will provide a growing share of nature-based solutions finance. So by 2030, annual private finance can potentially increase by almost 70 billion on top of current flows of 35 billion per year. And the total annual nature-based finance from private sources will then reach over 100 billion by 2030, which is almost 3 times the current levels. And an additional 210 billion per year will bring a total private nature-based finance to almost 250. So while the relative share of private finance increased over time from 18 to 3%, government expenditure will continue to provide most of the finance for nature-based solutions, and therefore most, dramatically increase to ensure real targets are met. And in this context, the dominance of public funding for nature-based solutions to address climate, biodiversity loss, and land degradation is likely to continue. So features associated with investing in nature-based solutions may limit uptake by private actors, including the high opportunity of cost of land, high market risk in countries with nature-based solution potential, high transaction costs, as well as the public goods nature of many ecosystem services provided by nature-based solutions. Next one. And finally, most countries have agreed to the goals and targets of the Paris Agreement, so the Global Biodiversity Framework and the United Nations Conventions to combat desertification. But however, national commitments and actions to implement those targets are not well aligned with global targets. So for example, current emissions reductions in national determined contributions fall well short of the reduction needs under the Paris Agreement and point to a 2.8 degree temperature rise by the end of the century. And a new scenario is thus introduced to reflect the inadequacy of current climate, biodiversity, and restoration commitments. So here, the forecast policy trajectory scenario is based on the inevitable policy response scenario developed by the UN. It's based on current commitments, the likelihood of policy implementation and market trends. And these scenario models shows how countries, like in a way, fall short of protected area restoration and climate commitments. So in this figure specifically, we can see the forecast policy trajectory. So that is the likely trajectory for nature-based solution finance if countries do not take strong and urgent action to align national commitments with full implementation of the Rio Convention targets. So a cumulative shortfall of roughly 600 million by 2030 grows to almost 5 trillion by 2050, which is, it represents serious implications for actions that are needed to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. And under the forecast policy trajectory, there is significantly less investments in forestry and restoration. And this is particularly in peatland restoration, which is a very high carbon sequestration potential compared to other nature-based solutions, for instance. And this is due to the relatively high cost and reliance on carbon prices and different sorts of policies. So overall, what somehow we can take is that forecast policy trajectory scenarios in a way highlight the urgent need for stronger and more aligned national commitments to meet the different sort of global targets, which are really crucial. Yeah.
Exactly. No, thank you so much. I think this gives really like a good good overview where we are at the moment, and let me take now a bit of, we still have roughly half an hour left, and we will take a look a bit like, okay, what else needs to be considered, and a bit like to frame like a bit like what we have just heard, and also meanwhile also quickly send you warm regards from Michael. Unfortunately, had to leave as you have seen. He's like a bit in the middle of the conference in Sevilla at the moment. I think also some of your colleagues might also be there, so we apologize for that. Looking when we're talking about the financing the nature positive transition, we can also distinguish between different actors actually who are involved there, and I think this is similar to what you already might know from the climate finance field. So in public, we're talking about multilateral development banks, but also national and regional governments, intergovernmental organizations, but also central banks and supervisory bodies are playing an important role as they're laying the foundation and, for example, the guidelines, including conducting stress testing, etc. And on the other hand, we're talking about private actors. We have heard from Michael that there's really like a strong need for private sector involvement and also to mobilize the necessary funding for nature positive transition. We're talking about financial institutions, in this case, not only about banks and investors, but also insurances, as we have heard earlier as well, but also like the real economy corporates. And how do they finance the transition? I think this is also nothing completely new for you. So it's actually like the similar processes that we have for climate finance or in general financing instruments. So especially the public sector can support through development, official development at ODA, and also development financing, also providing subsidies, sovereign bonds, or doing through procurement, but also grant funded conservation projects or payment for ecosystem services, as you heard from Michael as well earlier. That is a really important tool, which will be put more emphasis on as well. Looking at the private sector has also through the financial institutions several instruments which can be used. So I think everyone is aware of what a sustainability linked bond or loan is. So a bond or loan just linked to certain KPIs which have in this case, or certain nature positive KPIs, for example, or biodiversity KPIs, which as soon as achieved, the borrower gets like a better interest rate, for instance, but also we'll be talking about useful proceeds, which are nature focused, could also be another instrument. But we can be talking also about impact funds, where really like the positive impact of the investment of the project is in the focus. We're talking about, and this was mentioned earlier already, also about biodiversity certification or credits. So similar with the carbon credits market, there's also like involving market establishing and concerning biodiversity certificates or credits, which is also helpful. And last but not least, also there's always, and I think the DFIs are important vehicle. Also, like there's a lot of different blended options, for example, for nature structure, but also for debt for nature swaps. So releasing debt for countries against certain environmental commitments, but also conservation bonds. I think you might have heard about the Rhino or blue bonds, which are tools and financing mechanisms in order to create and foster a nature positive transition. Let's have a quick look then. Okay, what are the different investment opportunities in biodiversity, and especially here with a focus in biodiversity conservation and protection. So the first category, what you can see here, includes investment activities that not generate biodiversity or nature co-benefits while supporting core business operations. They can often be part of broader sustainability strategies in sectors like in agriculture, in forestry, or in tourism. Also, different examples can include climate smart agriculture, generative agribusiness. All of them have the aim really like to reduce environmental impacts, while on the other hand, maintaining productivity. Also, there might be others as well, like waste management or plastic management, circular economy, etc., ecosystem, ecotourism services, etc. They're also somehow indirectly supporting biodiversity indirectly, while especially delivering a business value. So especially like the focus is here, we like of nature or biodiversity nature co-benefits, while the main purpose is something else. Second, investment options focus on investment that in projects that enhance ecosystem services, typically through nature-based solutions. Here again, we come back to that. These projects are natural systems to deliver infrastructure-like benefits. For example, natural infrastructure can prevent agrochemical runoffs into rivers, for example. Investing, for example, in restoration of wetlands can be used for water treatment, for example. I think mangroves is like the classical example as well. It helps reduce coastal flooding, and insurance can be also designed, for example, to support green infrastructure. Last but not least, there's a third category of possible investments or investment horizon where investments can be made in. This includes investment biodiversity conservation is the primary objective. So really like having in comparison to the other two, really have the conservation or biodiversity conservation as the primary objective, as the ultimate goal. And these are more targeted and often involve as the public-private partnerships, so especially with blended financing instruments or even philanthropic funding. And this could be payment for ecosystem services, this could be fire management, but also investments in REDD+ projects as well. And as I mentioned, these initiatives are really designed to specifically protect and restore ecosystems and also biodiversity. So meanwhile, these are projects or these are investment categories where money can flow to create positive biodiversity positive outcomes. It's also interesting to see, okay, what are actually bankable nature-based solutions? So looking from the banking perspectives and not bankable nature solutions in this case are really financially viable projects that support the development of, as you have said, more climate resilient and sustainable landscapes and economies. And the bankability of the projects enables then also like a faster scaling and replication. That I think this is also what we're always looking for, so that we can create more positive impact on nature and communities, that we can also improve or we can improve the scale of these investments. And here again, this is similar to what we have just seen before. I just want to repeat too much. And the only difference is that, for example, here in the category of environmental protection, ecotourism, revenues are generated through direct tourism visitations. For example, KPIs got here the bed nights, use of equipment, etc. But also revenues through secondary activities. So the overall value chain of, in this case, of tourism could be mentioned here. And interesting here it's really like the distinction between what is the financing need. For example, like for this, the initial capital investment needed for the creation of new lodge, for example, if you talk about ecotourism, and of funding could be, in this case, normally would be the funding instrument in this case would be indirect debt, so loan, for example, from local financial institutions, etc. I don't want to go into detail into the others, but quickly only show you how typical cash flows would look like for two areas, which would do two other areas. So, for example, if you're talking about sustainable forestry, like the financing need, as you might understand now, is really the initial capital investment and an ongoing operation, because land needs to be acquired, equipment as well, planting and maintenance of trees needs to be financed, and for that purpose, especially one of the examples for funding could be equity funds, and because like at the end, desired outcomes is that this project or this investment generates the revenues from timber sales, for example, for a newly planned facility, but you have to consider that this normally takes a bit longer time until it really generates revenues, and so that also you see here later in the overall cash flow. But also there could be other additional revenue streams or payment for ecosystem services as soon as, for example, the forest or the trees have been planted could also be one of the desired outcomes. If you're talking about sustainable agriculture, it's again similar. So like here the idea is like change from traditional agriculture models to rather sustainable agriculture models, and here capital needs to be invested to adjust traditional practices, as I just said. So really changing the way of doing business. And this is normally then financed through debt, in this case, a loan, for example, through a local bank. And here the desired outcomes are a bit different. So on the one hand, we have cost savings, for example, because we don't need to use, or the farmer don't need to use artificial inputs such as reduced fuel and fertilizers, pesticides. So this is like a cost savings. This is then displayed here, for example, in this color. But on the other hand, could also be premium prices, can also charge premium prices in the market for environmentally supportive practices, and also for the products. So this is just like and if you're interested in to see, there are more examples which will be provided by the EIB, so European Investment Bank. About like typical projects which be invested in nature, and also like the associated cash flows. We have here the link, and you can after the presentation we share the information with you so that you can have a look at this as well. We just took two examples now on the purpose of this presentation. Good. This was more or less like for you to understand the really big picture of like what biodiversity ecosystem look like. And I saw already earlier in the chat and like to see, okay, what the question is now, so then how all this information, all these numbers and figures are tracked and evaluated. Michael has already shared a few of them. We will not touch about everything, but and he mentioned in the chat if you want to have a look. So you're talking about the OECD, RIA markers, you're talking about IMF, COFOG, etc. But we will just show you a few one. But first of all, my question for you, looking at your institution, looking at your DFI, do you currently monitor and track biodiversity-related investments? So here again, like we use the Slido, either say, yes, we're doing it very actively, or you say, no, we're not doing it yet, but we maybe want to do it or will do it. Or you just say, well, actually, I don't know. Just we wait a few seconds so that everyone can provide their. So 2 persons have responded already. Yes, okay. Yes, the few are doing it already. Others not yet. So 60-40. A few more, maybe. Yeah, okay, there are more than who are doing it already. Just give you a few more seconds that you can contribute to this poll. Okay, so it looks like it's manifesting that quite a few of you already are doing and tracking and monitoring biodiversity-related investments and financial flows. So then, okay, 50-50. Okay, we have a few who are doing it and others not. So especially to the ones who are doing it, who responded with yes, which are 4 people. Which tools and instruments do you use? Just type it again, like as a word cloud. Just what are the tools instrument you're using? Do you have your own tool? You use any of the tools which Michael was mentioning in the chat? What are the tools you're currently using? It'd be interesting to hear that from you. Also, if anyone just want to activate the microphone, just also please feel free to do it and to share with that what you're doing, how you are monitoring and tracking CPs on biodiversity. Okay. What else? Someone else is typing. When anyone wants to share IDFC methodology, good. I was actually hoping that you mentioned this. Remarkers for biodiversity, very good. Okay, yeah, good. No, I think it looks already very good that that you are applying it. But maybe let's before we go to, I think we will have a quick look what the real markers are, especially for the ones who have are not monitoring and tracking it. Would be helpful that also in case there's any other reflection, maybe sharing experience, and you can just jump in. But maybe let's have a first look why we think that transparency, accountability, and that biodiversity is important, because they actually are, they are when we clearly see, for example, that where the funds are coming from and where they're going, and how they actually are being used. Not that we gain the ability to track real progress toward the biodiversity targets, especially talking about like the frameworks such as the Global Biodiversity Framework. But it also allows us actually to identify the gaps and efficiencies in the funding. It ensures also that limited resources are being used where they are most needed. So with the efficiency argument. But also transparency helps improve data quality, both for the national planning, international reporting. We will see it in a second and discuss it in a second. But it's also important because it builds credibility and trust among donors, stakeholders, as well as the public. But also on the other hand, when financial flows are clearly documented and audited, it also enables better evidence-based. And I think this is like something which we strongly learned also from the climate discussion. Really have scientific evidence-based decision making. It's really helpful, and because it guards also against inflated or duplicated reporting, which is then especially related to double counting, but also foster like responsible spending. So let's have a look. There are different tools, as I mentioned, and frameworks for tracking financial flows on the international It really, we have to distinguish a bit what can be used, which methods and tools can be used for international public funding, domestic public funding, but also domestic and international private funding. So for international public funding, especially, this indicator tracks the total amount of international public funding that is supporting biodiversity. And it includes official development assistance, so ODAs, but also other flows. And they're all reported primarily through the OECD creditor reporting system. I think this was mentioned earlier in the chat by Michael. So especially here, we are talking about the OECD using biodiversity markers, which is like a global reporting system where the donors classify the development finance as biodiversity related using standard markers. You will have a look at it in a second. Then also the TOSSD data might be helpful, which is a framework to tracking official support from developing countries and partnerships, capturing biodiversity related financial flows, not included in this case in the traditional ODAs, in the ODA reporting. Talking about domestic public funding, there are three main tools which are used. On the one hand, we have the BioFin. We also have a look at it a bit more detail in a second, which is just a methodology, in this case for UNDP, to identify and classify and also to track biodiversity related finance across public, private, and international sources. The CEP, so classification of environmental purposes, is also a system like to use in this case to categorize government environmental expenditures. And then also mentioned by Michael in the chat, for classification on the functions of government, which is actually a UN standard used to classify government expenditures by functions, for example, health, environment, and also it's enabling to tracking biodiversity spending. And then also looking in comparison to that, also in domestic and international private funding, what we will see here is that there are different tools which are already mentioned here are used in order to check, but also like also, for example, philanthropy, mobilized resources as offsets, payment system services are also tracked accordingly here in this area. For the ones who are not familiar yet with the OECD DAC biodiversity or Rio markers, quickly have a look at what they are. The main purpose is to promote accountability toward international commitments, like I said, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also like to allow, especially for global comparison of biodiversity-related aid. The system has some limitations. It's based on self-reporting, in this case by the donors, which can be sometimes subjective, but also the scoring is qualitative, meaning it doesn't really reflect the exact funding amounts, and projects are marked as significant, you will see it later, may overstate the actual biodiversity impact. So this is then linked to the methodology, because the methodology actually said, okay, that there are projects can be scored at with the score 0, that would mean not the biodiversity in this case is not targeted. 1 it would means significantly objective, or 2, which is like biodiversity is really like the principal objective of the investment or of the spending. And these scores are then reported to the OECD and used alongside the other RIA markers for climate, etc., and desertification in order to assess like the overall flows going development ODA flows. Just an example. It's a fictive example, so it's so we have an example. In this case, it's a forest conservation project. We have a donor, which is in France, for example, the AfD is financing it. And this project is aiming to reduce deforestation in tropical rainforest on the one hand by supporting sustainable forest management practices, strengthening forest governance, enhancing local community livelihoods through agroforestry and ecotourism. So only from this information, what do you think? Is this project, how would you score this project? Is it 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2? What would it be? Just write in the chat, or if you want to activate your microphone, also you can do so. What do you think? 0, 1, 2, just from this information and based on the methodology just explained. Lydia, 2? Yeah, anyone else? Who else says 2? Yeah, a lot of people say 2, yes. Exactly, yeah, this is 2. This is quite obvious in this case. So what would it mean? What it mean here in this case, 2 would mean, and as you have done it correctly, biodiversity is the main objective. Now we have here from the title, also from the objectives, the project as core focus is on the conserving tropical rainforest biodiversity. If it would be significant, then we would say, okay, the project's primary goal was to was poverty reduction, but diversity was included somehow, as a supporting element. Not think about co-benefits, and 0 would be if forest component were minimal or incidental biodiversity is not mentioned as a goal. It might be 0. No, so I think that's like was a very good exercising, and you did it very well. So good. Then let's have a quick look at what is UNDP biofin tracking methodology all about. We will also in other sessions that you're coming up go a bit more detail, but just like that you heard about it. But first of all, like we have to ask ourselves, what is the biodiversity expenditure? There are different biodiversity expenditure reviews being published through using the biofin methodology, and it's actually expenditure whose purpose is to have positive impact or reduce or eliminate pressures on biodiversity. And so in this case, it means that these biodiversity expenditure include primary expenditures that have biodiversity as their primary purpose, so category 2, as we have heard earlier, as well as a secondary expenditure where biodiversity is clearly identified as an objective. So the methodology has actually 5 different steps. So first step is like really to prepare. That means involving defining the scope of the review, identifying key stakeholders, the data sources, and setting up a data management system. Then in the second step, it's like to define the parameters, what actually counts as biodiversity expenditure. You can either establish a classification system, or there are also other tools available, and which helps you to classify the investments and the projects against different biodiversity goals, and define also their attribute spending to biodiversity. As I said, like linked to this here, what we just said, whether it's primary or secondary. Then the third step is the data collection. So just as it says, not gathering data. Gathering the data from public and private sources, donors, and also civil society organizations. And then in step 4, it's really like talking about the analysis. So how much of the collected expenditure is truly biodiversity related? So I think this is one of the important steps, really, because depending on this because of the analysis, then the different values will be established. And last but not least, in step 5 is talking about project future expenditure, which actually assesses future trends and influencing factors such as inflation or GDP growth, and to see what impact this might have on the biodiversity expenditure. So this is like in a nutshell what it's all about. Let's have a quick look then. Also, since we're quite ahead of time, but I think it's still okay. I will leave you with in the slides an example from Colombia, where has used the biofin tracking methodology, and so their result actually show that they have here you see composition of the financing for biodiversity, and in this case, international cooperation was 5.2%, when public was 93.9%. And the private was 0.8%, which they have found out between the year for spending between 2014 and 2023. In this step, as I mentioned, there's this classification system. UNDP, biofin, they've also developed their own tracking methodology, in this case, the globe taxonomy. And I want to quickly show you just a snapshot of what it is all about. It's really like a listing of different biodiversity expenditures that addressing existing global and national frameworks, and provides also standards for appropriate attribution. And they have defined 9 different primary biodiversity expenditure categories, which are these ones. I don't want to look at them, but they have also in there, and it's really worth to have a look at it, because they are also providing really clear and also like very easy to understand decision trees and to assess and to work towards the application of the taxonomy. And we quickly wanted to show you this one. So this is the example of how to identify appropriate primary biodiversity category, the ones which I just showed you, the 9. And as I said, they're working with the decision tree. So the first question could be, does the expenditure aim to create the right framework and conditions for effective biodiversity measures? So for example, adopting laws, finance solutions, raising awareness. And if you could say this with yes, then you're talking about enabling conditions. So it would be could be classified in the category 2, awareness and knowledge, or in the appropriate the biodiversity category, planning and finance, and so on and so forth. So then if you would say no, then there's another question, and then you would lead you to one of the different categories which are you using in order to assess and classify your investments. On the other hand, also, as we mentioned earlier already, that is very important also like to identify what is the biodiversity distribution rate. So to go next animation, and there's a similar decision tree. So actually what the methodology does, it does between like either is the attribution 100% or is there nothing at all. And I think this decision tree, just to show you what it is all about, it's really like very easy to go through actually to this exercise. It really starts from from the name of the program or project. Is it possible to conclude that the main objective intention of the project is biodiversity? Would say yes. And also do some other additional exercise, but just like a very first rough estimation, then you could say, okay, well, the rate is 100%. If you say no, then there's the next question about, is it possible to know some details of the program objective, if it's aim, targets, the description, the objectives, and if you say yes, then also can lead like to a rate of 100%, but it could also then lead in depending on the different questions which are associated here up to like, and you can rate based, but it just has like the biodiversity attribution rate with it. Then very briefly, there's also, since the IFD's biodiversity finance tracking method, it's actually a similar process. So it follows a 3-step process. First of all, like selection of the eligibility for biodiversity finance accounting, then the qualification for the principal impact for biodiversity, and last but not least, weighting of the project's biodiversity finance. And here you see again, this is similar. Each methodology has its own weighting categories, and here you see, for example, 100% would mean complete protection. Then we're talking about restoration, 80%. If it's 6%, it would be a weighting factor if the project or the investment is integrated in spatial or land use planning, up to reduction of local pressures, and the weighting factor in this case would be 20%. So this is like in this case how FD is looking forward to track for the biodiversity finance tracking. Just looking, because we are on time. I only want to show you one. I have more slides, but I quickly wanted to show you one framework, which I think is very much and very nicely linked to what Michael has said when we're talking especially about nature positive finance. And as this is the nature finance framework by the World Bank. In this case, nature positive finance, what it means is it's finance that expected to deliver measurable positive outcomes for biodiversity ecosystem services, which is relative then to business as usual scenario. The nature finance mainstreaming is another category, which is actually meaning that it's expected to enable a broader economic transition towards practices that are aligned with delivering a nature positive goals, so something in between. And then we have the third category, which is called nature impact mitigation finance, which is likely strictly at identifying and evaluating and mapping potential adverse risks of impacts of projects on nature, in accordance also with ESF and PS. So I think this is like this is more or less what the tracking categories are. And similar to the biofilm methodology, which we just discussed, they have also like a so-called decision tree with a 3-step approach. Step 1 is applying a taxonomy, really like to identify eligible activities across key sectors such as agriculture, energy, urban development. And then really the question is, no, does the finance support qualifying activities based on the taxonomy? If you say no, then it's not at all nature finance. If you say yes, okay, then you go then you go for the next step. And here, really, the idea is screen for potential risks to nature, ensuring that projects do not inadvertently contribute to biodiversity loss or harm critical habitats. And here again, like there's the question, okay, does it say yes? And you here look at no, look especially at drivers, habitats, species. If you say no in this category, no, so it actually is not fulfilling all the criteria, then we would label it as nature mainstreaming finance. And then if it qualifies, if you could confirm with yes, then it goes to step 3, which is then evaluating the project is expected to deliver also the measurable positive outcomes for nature. And here again, like here is very important that the World Bank is really looking at the causal pathway, which should be in place, that the finance is enabled, and also like the improvement of the states of biodiversity ecosystem services, compared again, or as we have just seen, to a business as usual case. And if you would say here no, then it would be tracked as a nature mainstreaming finance. But if you would say yes, then it would be labeled as nature positive finance, which I think from an impact perspective, I think would also be one of the most important outcomes and a desired outcomes here. I think this was just to show you a bit. We will deep dive into the different methodologies also, and also looking at the application, and also maybe from a few case studies from a few of you since you have experience already with this, during the on-site training, which will take place in September. But I think it gives you at least like a good umbrella and good overview of what is already existing. So for some of you, it might have been new. For some of you, you might heard about it or even applying it, or even experts in that. So yeah, I think this was a bit like what we wanted to show you today. And yeah, we would like to thank you for your attention. I don't know I think we might still have a few minutes for questions or any comments or sharing of experience, as you have said earlier, because I think quite a few are very much advanced already with your tracking methodologies, but also with your financing for biodiversity. I leave here also my contact details, or our contact details. So are there any questions, any comments, any suggestions, anything? Just in the chat whether there's any. Okay, good. If there are no questions, I think this was helpful for you. As Ghislaine was saying, and I hope that was also happening with the first presentation already, we will do now is to share the presentation as well as the recording of the session. We will share it with you so that you can also have a look at it afterwards. With that, I think thank you for your participation, for your engagement, for interactivity as well, and joining the session. And then, yeah, have good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And then, yeah, looking forward to see you in the next session, which is then taking place end of July.
Thank you, Jonas. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.